Welcome to my Commodore 64 Games Memories. This is where I look at old games and some of the technical details behind them. Let's get into it. Today we have Pogo Joe. This is one of the earlier Commodore 64 games, published in 1983 by Screenplay. It was written by William F. Denman Jr. and Oliver Steele. The artwork was by Michael Hare, I think it was, and Stephen Baumrucker also wrote the music and sound routines. I think he also named the levels. This is basically like a Cubert clone, but it has some extra features in the game, of course, because games design will also evolve over time. So you can set up all of the configuration for the game here, which I seem to remember was quite useful when I was much younger and not able to play this well, and now I'm a lot older, I'm also unable to play it well. So you take control of Pogo Joe and you try and change the blocks from the barrels from one colour to the other, and there are flashing barrels where you can kill the enemies, and then once you change the level colours or the barrel colours to how the game wants, then the level completes and you move on to the next level. So actually the animation in this game is pretty good. It's got a few different varieties of enemies, and the main character's animation is also quite detailed for the time that this was actually published. As I said, back in 1983. This was one of my earliest games, not the earliest game that I had on the Commodore 64. I think it turned up on some dodgy C15 or C30 or C90 tape or something like that, copied from a friend, or probably a friend of my dad who also had a Commodore 64 earlier than we did at home. I was pretty young. I must have been 11 or 12, I think, when I was playing this game. And I do remember spending a lot of time on it. The music and sound effects are pretty much typical of the time. Most of the music and sound effects from back in this day use pretty simple envelope settings and didn't apply much vibrato or voice waveform mixing techniques. Pretty much quite simple. Now, when I was a young developer trying to develop my own games at home, when I was 11 or 12 years old, at this particular point in time, I wanted to find out how this was working. So, as with most of the games that I owned back in the day, or rather had copies of back in the day, I would try and find out how they worked, because I wanted to also write games. So let's start digging into modern development tools which can show us how this game works a lot easier and a lot quicker, to how in the old days I used to do it, where it used to be trying to reset the Commodore 64 with a paperclip and then trying to poke through memory to see what was left. So here we have the ICU64 debugger. I'm going to be using this debugger to show us what's inside the Pogo Joe game. So as Pogo Joe is running, I can use the ICU tool to actually show different bitmaps, so I can see that there is a bitmap screen. And now the other screen is showing on the Commodore 64. It looks like it's text-based rather than bitmap-based, which is not a surprise. We can see here actually that the music routine is scanning through memory by reading memory addresses consecutively, and there are 3 traces for the music routine because there are 3 voices. So here we can isolate with quite a high degree of certainty where the music and sound routines are in terms of the code and also in terms of the data. So if we restart, we can see actually that the bouncing letters on the bitmap were actually part of the bitmap screen. It wasn't using sprites or anything like that. Technically, I suppose you could say that it was using software sprites. Now I'm hunting through the memory using the text screen viewer. We can see that there is a text screen that contains this character data. Now this is the main game screen, and it is actually not using a text mode for most of it. We can actually see that it's rendered the barrels to a bitmap screen again. Now this choice of using the bitmap screen is actually relatively unusual because back in those days it wasn't very easy to scroll the bitmap screen very quickly. It needed quite a lot of highly optimized code to be able to update the bitmap screen quickly, so it wasn't tended to be used for games, but in this game it works pretty well because you have a static screen where when you want to remove the barrels or change the barrels' colours, rather, you just set the colours of the barrels in alignment with their character cell boundaries, and in the bitmap screen you can do that, and then you can just set the colours of the tops of the barrels just by setting one of the colours. Because the bitmap screen actually has two character-based screens that it uses for colours, but then it also has the 8 kilobytes of complete bitmap data. So generally speaking, it's relatively quick to update just the colours in a bitmap, but it's very slow to update the rest of the bitmap data. What we can see here is the text of the score panel, so actually there is probably a raster interrupt to change from a text screen at the top to a bitmap screen at the bottom. Here we can actually see that there is text in memory, a large block of text. This large block of text seems to be mostly title screen and level name data. So there we have it. That was a very quick overview about the technical details of this old retro game. C64 is one of the tools that I use when I'm trying to reverse engineer or when I'm trying to debug something that's gone wrong in software that I write these days. I also use other tools, and I'll get into those later on. If you like this kind of video, then please do consider liking and subscribing to this channel, and I'll add more later on. Take care, have a great day.